Hey everyone, welcome to another Angry Artist podcast. I talk a lot of business related stuff when it comes to art, and as well as what can be inspirational for people who might be listening to this. But I haven't really talked about technique for a while, so I figured this might be the time to talk about more art theory. For this episode, I'm going to be talking about proportions, specifically human proportions. Now, as everyone who has probably went outside for the past, I don't know, forever, they would know that humans come in all shapes and sizes. So why do we have art books that talk about ideal proportions? And that's on a very loose term. It might be seen as perhaps a little bit of body shaming, right? But there is merit to it, and I'll explain why. It comes down to what's good about using ideal proportions. Generally, in your art career, I doubt you'll ever hit the point where all you have to do is draw ideal proportions. But I will say, knowing ideal proportions is a good way of learning. What I mean by that is you're very unlikely to, for example, draw a figure that's 7 heads tall for the rest of your life. But it's good as a starting point if you're a beginner artist. Ideal proportions are a framework that was derived in nature. It's sort of like the average. It can work in a lot of situations. Despite the fact that humans come in a lot of shapes and sizes, chances are you don't want to draw a human and have their heads, for example, 4 feet tall. We have limitations of what can be possible in nature. So a lot of the old time tutorials, such as Andrew Loomis, as well as a lot of anatomy books, will tell you, hey, maybe if you want to start somewhere, we shouldn't be drawing heads that are 4 feet tall or arms that are 2 feet thick. They give you set proportions that no matter how much you screw up, as long as it's close to what it is, you're gonna draw something that's close to a human being. And of course, if you want to twist those proportions, you can do so. So if you want to make the ribcage a little bit bigger, then sure, you want to make a fatter person, then maybe extend the hips, maybe make the legs and arms thicker. You know what I mean. As long as you have that initial image of ideal proportions, then you can bring it into a whole realm of new possibilities. The reality is, if we're going to make a human being that can move in a realistic manner, then they would have to adhere to physics and the rules of science. For instance, it's unlikely if somebody has an average torso that they can be able to lift arms that are bigger than their torsos. And of course, if maybe your character is huge from waist up, then their legs will probably have to be huge to lift all that weight. Ideal proportions are foolproof in that. It always looks like it can work in reality. Of course, as I said before, the moment you start stylizing, you're going to have to make sure that it makes sense. So this goes into how do you do so? With so many human beings in the world, it's hard to really tie down, okay, how do I draw these proportions? The answer is, as with before, you have to observe reality. There are a lot of characters in reality. Especially if you're a character designer like me, you'll start to notice that there are trends in certain jobs to certain body types, what's possible for certain ages, and what's really common among different ethnicity groups. It sounds like I'm being prejudiced, but genetics play a lot in how we look, and you'll notice that perhaps there are stereotypes when it comes to certain people. It's really analytics when it comes down to it, and there's nothing wrong with really understanding that maybe there's certain reasons why things look the way they do. So, for example, athletes will probably look super fit. They can be skinny, or maybe powerlifters are huge and they have a bit of fat to them. That's applicable for sumo wrestlers as well. You probably wouldn't see very many skinny sumo wrestlers. It all comes down to their character and their roles in life. A person who works in an office 24/7 is probably going to look a bit fatter than somebody who has to survive in the jungle for a few months. So what I mean by all of this is proportions are malleable, but they have to make sense to what you're trying to achieve. What I find with a lot of people's work when they're starting out is that the proportions tend to not fit the character. Now, of course, this can be applicable in a lot of cases. So, for example, in anime, a lot of the girls are probably gonna look a bit more sexualized than normal. I know there's a lot of people who want to draw hourglass figures and such, but it doesn't always serve the right function. The first thing you have to do as an artist is make sure that it looks functional. This also applies to human beings. There's a lot of liberty to that when you're trying to do something that can sell. So of course, as with the anime example, if you're trying to draw appealing girls, then there are probably very specific proportions that always seems to work. Hate to say it, as a person who is ugly as hell in real life, yes, there are proportions that are more appealing than others. Now that said, functionality still overrides everything else. Chances are, if you're trying to draw a UFC fighter, the proportions probably aren't going to be the same as a supermodel, and you might want to put a supermodel in the character role, but it's not going to read very well. People are not going to believe it. And the worst thing you can do is when your proportions make people disbelieve. Again, everything has to be derived from reality. You cannot have fantasy if it's not grounded by a bit of reality. Weight distribution is a big deal. The moment somebody looks at someone, while there are exceptions, you'll probably get a sense of maybe how fast they move, maybe their role in life, what's their jobs that they do every day. Usain Bolt is not really ideal proportions, but they're ideal for running. If we were to talk about how to morph an ideal proportioned body from art books into Usain Bolt, you'll probably say maybe it's a bit lankier, legs might be a bit bigger. A sumo wrestler is probably going to be thicker than ideal proportions, but again, it still can be worked and referenced from the initial starting point, the ideal proportions. So to end it off, the point being, ideal proportions are simply a complete average of everything else. It's so average that you can probably just build it off into anything you want. The reality is, the way I think about it, the world has ideal proportions for every single job or role out there. You are what you do. You are what you eat. And genetics play a part of it, but in general, great character designs will immediately tell you what their role in the story is. Unless you're doing it for comedic effect, a 400-pound person is probably not going to be a world championship runner. We see human beings every day, no matter who you are. People will know when something looks incorrect or something looks impossible. The really sad part about character designs is when a character design is good, generally they just meld with the story and people don't notice. Bad character designs will immediately take the immersion out of the audience. And of course, with other things as well, proportions are one of the aspects that can change the way people think about your characters. Make sure you study reality over and over again and understand, hey, maybe this guy has bigger legs. Why is this happening? This guy has huge arms. Why is this happening? This guy is really big or really skinny. Why is this happening? Always question what you observe, and eventually you understand there are patterns in human proportions. Anyways, thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.